You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Sudan is currently in the middle of a massive humanitarian crisis after war erupted there in 2023. We're going to turn now to KUOW's Paige Browning, who talked to a few people about how this war is impacting communities here in Washington and what's fueling this crisis in the first place. Here's Paige.
Thanks, Libby. In December 2023, Bellevue organizer Mubarak Elamin needed to rescue his mother.
I was trying to get my family to leave the country, but they did not want to leave. They did not want to leave their home.
She was still in Sudan, where he used to visit every year. But earlier in April, a brutal war had broken out between the country's army, the Sudanese Armed Forces, and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. The situation deteriorated into what the UN has called one of the world's largest humanitarian crises. Thousands have been killed and millions displaced. Some regions are suffering from famine. In January, the United States declared Sudan was experiencing a genocide. When Mubarak returned to get his mother out of the country, he was only there for a single day.
This is a country that I used to go and feel home. It's my place of birth. And I was feeling fear all across the places that I visited, whether it's a hotel or the market, or even just people that are, walking on the street. And for one day, it was the most intense day of my life.
His mother is still with him today. What she expected would be a short stay turned into more than 2 years away from her home as instability grows in Sudan. And despite this upheaval, Mubarak says it seems like a lot of people don't know what's going on in Sudan.
Until recently, just this last week, we start seeing a lot more attention paid to Sudanese issue. And people start talking about how come we did not know about this, the largest catastrophe in recent history. It's happening in Sudan right now. And the world did not know. Most people didn't actually know what's happening in Sudan. So it's a failure on the media side as well. But as a Sudanese in Washington State, we also tried our best to put the word out, to engage, to rally.
Mubarak obviously has a personal connection to what's happening in Sudan, and it's on his mind a lot. But some might be paying attention to the war for the first time. Let's talk now with Nisrin Elamin, an assistant professor of Anthropology and African Studies at the University of Toronto. She's here to help us understand what's been going on in Sudan over the past few years. Thank you so much for being here this morning, Professor Elamin.
Thank you so much for having me and for covering what's happening in Sudan.
The war has been going on for well over 2 years, but now we're seeing images and videos going viral on social media. We're going to talk about why that is in a moment, but first, can you give us a quick overview of how this war started?
Sure. I usually like to trace it back to a military coup that took place on October of 2021, a joint coup between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces to essentially upend a process that was supposed to lead us towards civilian rule and democratic elections, right? In the aftermath of a very powerful revolution that overthrew Omar al-Bashir after 30 years in power, a very brutal dictatorship. And so I like to think of this war as a counter-revolutionary war because in April of 2023, these two factions of the military coup regime essentially split and began fighting, essentially vying for economic and political power of the country. But it's also an internationalized war in the sense that both sides are being supported by external backers.
Recent satellite images appear to show now evidence of mass graves in part of the country where the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, has made inroads. Obviously, these images have been shocking for people to see, but they did not come out of nowhere. As you talk about, this has been going on for a couple of years. Thousands of people have died and millions have been displaced since the crisis started. There's been discourse online about how the crisis in Sudan has gone largely unnoticed. So I'm wondering if you agree, and if so, why do you think it's taken a while for people to pay attention?
Yeah, that's a very good question. As you mentioned, this war has produced the world's largest displacement, humanitarian and hunger crisis in a country, I should say, that could easily feed itself. Some of what we're seeing right now is that all eyes are on Al-Fashir in North Darfur, where after 18 months of a brutal siege, we're witnessing the Rapid Support Forces commit genocide, essentially, as it takes full control of the capital of North Darfur, Al-Fashir. On October 26th, the army withdrew. And I think, it's important for listeners to know that the RSF kind of owes this military victory in large part to the logistical and military support it receives from the United Arab Emirates in exchange for Sudanese gold. And so what we've seen over the last couple of days is pools of blood and dead bodies from space, essentially through satellite images, in Darfur, which was also the site of the first genocide of the 21st century, if your listeners remember. So we're seeing, the same perpetrators, the RSF at the time were called the Janjaweed, essentially perpetrate genocide again in a place, Al-Fashir, which was during the first genocide a safe haven for people displaced from their land by this genocide, who might have been children at the time, they're now parents. And we're looking at also a situation where there are still about 250,000 people trapped inside the city as the RSF takes full control with no food or medicine coming in. And so I think it's part of the reason, I would say, going back to your initial question, we've been seeing this sort of a lack of international attention, I think, is because of the external backers. In this particular case of the RSF, as I mentioned, the United Arab Emirates, there are other external backers. The army gets support from Egypt. But this war has become incredibly profitable for these external backers. They're extracting Sudanese gold, livestock, gum arabic. People are vying for space along our very long Red Sea coast. And I think as long as this war remains profitable and there is a quasi-media blackout, this will continue happening. So I think it's very important at the moment that there be pressure on the external backers. The United States could be imposing an arms embargo, for example, on the UAE until it stops supporting the RSF.
I wanted to also highlight something you said a few moments ago about the parents of children who are there now, that many of the people who are parents in Sudan have been through similar circumstances or battles for democracy as children themselves, and now are parents as their children are going through similar circumstances. And Professor, what's happening in Sudan is sometimes referred to the forgotten war, but I understand you don't think that's necessarily the best way to describe the situation. And why is that?
Well, I think there's been a kind of organized abandonment, as Ruthie Gilmore would say, of Sudan in order to facilitate resource extraction. I also think that, the genocide is happening specifically in Darfur, targeting indigenous, non-Arab farming communities that had previously been attacked during the genocide in the early 2000s and had been purposefully pushed off of their land, right? Resource-rich, fertile farming land. So I think, again, there are these historical roots that get almost forgotten when that's, I think, the part that gets forgotten about this war. We can't look at it in isolation, I think, of the previous wars against civilians that have been happening for decades. But also, I think there's a complicity here. I mean, I'm here in Canada. People have found Canadian arms, rifles, and straight armored vehicles in the hands of the RSF as they commit genocide. The UAE receives a lot of its arms from the United States and from Canada. And so I think there's a responsibility here to also right that wrong, right? And to say, okay, enough is enough. We're going to stop arming and facilitating genocide.
I'm talking with Professor Nisrin Elamin about the situation in Sudan. And Professor, in the past, you've also pushed back on describing what's happening in Sudan as a civil war. Why is that?
Well, I think it's an internationalized counter-revolutionary war. I think this war is meant to prevent and foreclose the possibility of civilian rule and popular democracy, as was articulated by the resistance committees that formed the backbone of the December Revolution of 2018 and 2019, that really envisioned a free, secular Sudan where everybody would have equal citizenship, and really kind of I think the resistance committees, and there's about 8,000 of them across the country. There are these neighborhood consensus-based committees that were essentially running the country in the absence of a functional state. And they've pivoted actually during this war to doing some incredible relief work on the ground. And so for me, I think what we're seeing, it's not a civil war, it's a war against civilians between military elites, right? And it's also a war that is meant to protect not only the interests of these elites, but also their international partners and backers. And so I think that's why I don't like to look at it as a civil war, but rather as an internationalized counter-revolutionary war.
You have talked about, as you were just saying, that there are other parties involved. There's a great deal of foreign intervention in Sudan. Can you talk more about how external players are affecting the crisis now? You know, who those players are, how they're affecting it.
Yes, absolutely. So on the army side, Egypt is providing critical support to the army, in part to protect its interests in relation to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, right? But also the Red Sea. And then you also have Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Qatar providing arms to the army. On the RSF side, there's the United Arab Emirates, but also the Russian Wagner Group, which I believe is now called the Africa Corps, that has been providing weapons. I mean, Russia is actually playing both sides. And again, I think all of them are vying for profit making, right? That's the kind of impetus here. They're interested in Sudanese land, right? In Sudan's mineral resources, in access to the Red Sea. The United Arab Emirates tried to, they actually signed a $6 billion port deal along the Red Sea coast just a year before this war broke out. And they've done this across the Horn of Africa. So I think Sudan actually is a cornerstone of a kind of broader strategy for them to expand their regional power. And ports play an important role because it allows them to kind of control networks and circuits of production and distribution across the region.
And Professor, pivoting a bit, you're also the co-founder of the Sudan Solidarity Collective. Why did you co-found this collective, and what does the work entail?
Yes, thank you for that question. So I was in Sudan when the war broke out, and within hours of the war breaking out, I witnessed young people from the resistance committees in the neighborhood that we were in pivot towards evacuating people, including diplomats and international aid workers.
Within hours?
Within hours, yes. People risked their lives during the so-called curfews that weren't really curfews to go get bread and distribute it in the neighborhood. They went to get water from the Nile because, of course, electricity and water immediately cut off, and brought it to elderly people who couldn't move. And so I was incredibly inspired by that. And when I returned, I was honestly a little bit depressed. I think I had survivor's guilt about having been able to leave with my newly acquired U.S. passport when most of my relatives were not able to leave.
And you said when you returned
Yes.
to Sudan or to the U.S.?
To Canada at the
To
time.
Canada. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And so I met, I'm a professor at the University of Toronto. I met with some of my students, and together we decided, we started to think about what is the most useful thing we can do at this moment as people in the diaspora witnessing our kin in Sudan suffering, during this brutal war. And we decided it was to support these emergency response rooms that started to emerge from the resistance committees. There's about 700 across the country. As I mentioned, within hours, they pivoted to emergency relief, started communal kitchens. They started running emergency health clinics. They started retrieving and burying bodies. And, essentially, again, running the country in the absence of a state, helping people survive while themselves as volunteers being impacted by the war.
I was going to say on few resources themselves, on few means. They're not government or military backed.
Exactly. And they're not registered NGOs either. They were getting some support from the few international agencies that remained in the country because they were able to operate in areas that those agencies were unable or unwilling to access due to bombings and so forth. So a lot of the volunteers that run these rooms choose to stay put under extremely dangerous circumstances because they feel a responsibility towards the people in their communities. And so we've raised about $1 million from mostly small donors, giving, say, $10 a month. And not only to emergency response rooms, but also to other mutual aid groups like the IDP Humanitarian Network, and other groups in Al-Fashir at the moment who are coordinating clandestine food drives in the middle of a genocide. And so I don't want listeners to come away from this feeling complete despair, even though the situation is catastrophic. I want them to feel inspired by the organizing that is happening, that is, to me, really a continuation of the revolution, because it's also the building blocks for popular democracy and freedom in the future.
Finally, what do you think people should know about Sudan today? We've talked about a lot. What do you think people should know, or what are people getting wrong about Sudan?
I think I want people to know that the people of Sudan are incredibly resilient. They're incredibly well organized. They, led a popular revolution that overthrew a 30-year dictatorship, right? And it was a nonviolent revolution that brought together people across divides that elites had been using for decades to pit people against each other. So against the odds, really, right? And so I want people to know that there's incredible potential in Sudan to move towards a sort of bottom-up democracy that the world has not seen yet, right? I think the resistance committees are really modeling this for us. If we think about 8,000 resistance committees, non-hierarchical, neighborhood-based committees that are running a country in a way that is there's a kind of horizontal leadership, there's a rotating leadership that is really, I think, modeling for the world what our own potential, right, to sort of capture power from elites and redistribute it to the masses, essentially. And I think that's really the future of the world, in my opinion, not only in Sudan, but also beyond its borders. Yeah.
Nisrin Elamin is an assistant professor of Anthropology and African Studies at the University of Toronto. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. And hey, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.